Um, Great. And so you all probably got a notice that we are going to be recording. So just so you know, we are planning on recording these sessions and then publishing them on our website later on. So if you have any concerns about that, or if you don't want to be recorded, please feel free to message either myself or Samantha in the chat. Okay. So we've gone through introductions and we've done some housekeeping, but because we want to make sure everyone can fully participate in the Zoom session, I'm going to kick it off to Francis, who has some further Zoom tips and housekeeping notes.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, everybody, I'm sure, or most everybody, I guess I don't want to assume, but I'm thinking everybody has had Zoom meetings by now, and we just want to make sure that you're familiar at least with the basics before we go forward. So if you are, we want to hear from people. This is a conversational meeting, so we do want to hear from you, and so make sure that you are unmuted when you speak, but at the same token, if you're not speaking, just make sure you're muted so we don't get the background noise, and that button is on the bottom left. Similarly, we'd love to see your face if you're okay with that, especially while you're talking, but we understand if you can't or don't want to. So that button is also on the bottom left. You can check your display name, and that is the name that appears over your video feed. And you can change that with the little blue box or in the participants area. You can also customize your view settings. That's the top right. And as Bishop Russell suggested, although I haven't played with it, I guess you can filter in some new looks for yourself so you don't have to Photoshop. And I guess you can do that too. I'm excited to see if anybody does that. React, you can, we like to have this be as interactive as possible, so feel free to use the reaction buttons, the clap, raise hand, etc. buttons. And then in terms of this meeting, there are a few things that we wanted to go over. We're going to try to keep tabs on people. If you are not speaking, if you want to raise your hand, we can put you in the queue to ask a question. I don't think anybody's on the phone, but if you are, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. And if you want to use your keyboard, for Windows, it's Alt-Y, or for Apple, it's Option-Y. The chat feature has served us really well for these meetings, and please feel free to ask questions using chat. That's a really great way if you have an idea or want to, if something pops in your mind during the conversation, we will be checking that as well. And finally, you know, sign in virtually. We have the registrations, but it's just a great way to keep track of who's on this the Zoom. So make sure that your name appears in the way that you'd like it in the video feed. And if you haven't already, announce your name and organization when the Q&A happens. It's also a great way for people to remember who you are and who asked what question. So yeah, let's have a good time. Let's keep it interactive. This should be more of a conversation, and we're excited to begin. So I will hand it back over to Sam.
Great. Thanks, Francis. Yeah, so the last session, for those that weren't with us, we talked a lot about the zoning and approval process in the city of Detroit and what were the roles of citizens and developers in the city. Today, we kind of want to take a step back and ask some more fundamental questions. And particularly, we want to get at, why is there uneven development in the city? So something we hear from many community groups is, you know, why does it feel like there is so much development happening downtown? Why is it so difficult to develop in some of our neighborhoods? And you know, why, in particular, why is it difficult to build affordable housing when it is desperately needed in our city? So today we're going to get at some of those questions, and spoiler alert, a lot of it has to do with how developers view projects and how they look at the feasibility within various markets and really measure risk. So in today's conversation, there's going to kind of be 3 points of conversation. There's going to be how do developers analyze risk? How can residents engage with developers? And then how does all of this affect affordable housing? And today we have 2 fantastic speakers. I'm really excited to have them. These are 2 of the most knowledgeable guys about how to build things in Detroit. And so our first presenter is Richard Hosey. And Richard is a Detroit native and a resident and owner of the Hosey Development LLC. He's completed projects include Kirby Center Lofts, Detroit Savings Bank, Capitol Park Lofts, and Farwell Lofts. Before pursuing development full-time, Richard was Senior Vice President at Bank of America, where he structured and was the lead financer of both the Broderick Tower and the David Whitney buildings in downtown Detroit. Richard's real estate experience encompasses more than 75 projects totaling over $2.5 billion, that's with a B, dollars in development costs. Richard serves on the board of the Detroit Housing Commission, the Detroit Land Bank Authority, and the Detroit Business Improvement Zone, the Detroit Downtown Development Authority, and the Detroit Historic District Commission, as well as the Michigan Community Capital and Michigan Historic Preservation Network. So thank you, Richard, for being here, especially we know how precious your time is given all of your extensive board participation. We also have Corey Leon with us. Corey joined the National Development Council, NDC, in 2011. As a field director, Corey works with municipal and nonprofit clients to analyze, underwrite, and structure community development projects, including affordable housing, mixed-use developments, market rate development, and special use projects, such as homeless shelters, solar panel arrays, etc. Prior to joining NDC, Corey was a consultant on signature projects such as the Book Cadillac Hotel, Broderick Tower, and the Forest Arms Apartments. He graduated with a master's in public policy from University of Michigan, a bachelor's in science and physics and political science from Western Michigan University, and is a proud Cass Tech alum. So welcome, Corey and Richard. So with that, I think I'm going to kick it off to you guys, and yeah, let's get started.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Yeah, I think that we were gonna, just start out with, general discussion about how developers approach projects, and I think, talking with Richard, he was talking about one of his projects recently, and Richard, when do you get paid? When do you actually make money on your projects?
So it's so because I do market rate projects, and because the banks and the MADC and the like are not very fond of market rate projects taking a developer fee, and a current developer fee. They'll let you defer it out for future. Then I get paid when the building is operating and collecting rents and that exceed the expenses. So it's which throws people off sometimes, because when you explain to them that you may start a project, in 2010 and get your first payout from it in 2015, it's kind of a daunting idea, but it all comes out of operations and cash out refinancing or sale.
Right. So you have to achieve a break even point,
Right.
Before you start making any money. Do you know what the break even point is on your most recent project?
Yeah, I would say in terms of rents, I would say probably an average rent of about $1,200 might be a break even point.
and that's at what occupancy?
Oh, and that's going to be at least at probably 85% occupancy. So, you know, I try to give a little bit of room below what the bank would like to see at the 95% occupancy, because you can have to cut rents, you know, based upon COVID or something along those lines. So I try to give more cushion, but generally it's, so when I think of my Kirby project, I want to say all of my money is in the last 4 units of the 26. And so, you know, until you get to that point, then you're just covering expenses. And so I was having this conversation actually with my management company recently, because they're like, oh, we're only, you know, only got 2 vacant units. And, well, yeah, that means I'm making half of what I would make if it was full, because it's all in those last units.
Right. And I think that that's the kind of the fundamental issue in development, is that a lot of the risk, there's a lot of risk up front, and the reward is kind of at the end. One of the things that I'd like to look at is, especially in terms of trying to incorporate affordable housing into projects, is to look at just the pure economics of it. You know, in the end, development is about the numbers. And I guess one of the things I just want to say is that oftentimes when developers and when underwriters talk about projects, we talk about projects in terms of math terms, and it can sound kind of cold. You know, I believe deeply in the fact that, you know, housing really should be a human right, and that, you know, if you're in a country that claims that it is advanced or great or rich or whatever adjective you want to put in front of it, if you can't house your people, I'm not sure that you should really be using those adjectives. So, you know, what I'm going to present in terms of some of the economics is the unfortunate way it is. It's not the way it should be, at least not in my opinion. Francis, could you go on to the slide with the risk reward chart?
Corey,
So
I just want to.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to chime in, and so in that, so I completely agree, but I believe that this set of numbers is still relevant even to the way it should be, and so because we need to know what it's going to cost to properly house people, you know, in adequate housing, regardless of who's absorbing that cost, and so, you know, it's whenever there's a plan that says, hey, let's make sure we fix everything, let's get everything together, someone's still going to ask, how much is that going to cost? And that number can often be surprising, you know, but it needs to be known so that we can put it in its proper place and gather the proper resources. Is you know, when I tell people the Detroit Housing Commission spends, you know, right around $100 million a year to house 10,000 families, it's shocking to them, because then, I mean, there's, you know, 70,000 families or 200,000 families in Detroit, and 70,000 of them that could use it. And so you quickly get to numbers that say we need a different method if what we need is, you know, $2 billion a year to properly house all of the families that need the affordable housing.
So Corey and Richard, I just wanted to point out, and I know we talked about this before, that this is a pretty daunting slide right here.
Yeah.
Lots of numbers.
I'll go through it. Yeah.
Well, and if you wouldn't even mind, if you could just even like give us some context about like what is this slide meant to convey, or like
Sure.
what is, yeah.
So one of the things that I think people don't realize about real estate is that there's a lot of fixed costs. And so, first of all, in terms of construction, there's a worldwide market in construction materials. So, even if we're having a recession in the US, if, China is booming, structural steel prices may still be going up exponentially because of those costs. It's the same thing with operating expenses for a unit. There's just a certain cost to operate a unit in the Detroit market. And it doesn't matter if that unit is being rented to a low-income family or a higher income family. Oftentimes many of those costs are fixed. So we have to keep those two things in mind, that developers are working with some constraints, some areas where there is no control over some of these costs. So what this chart really represents is, it looks at different area median incomes. So I base this on Wayne County's area median income for a one-person household. And so at the top, there's, the 20%, 30%, 40%, all the way up to the 100%. So the area median income for Wayne County is $55,000 for a one-person household. And it then compares, it then looks at, so that the federal government says that 30%, households shouldn't pay more than 30% for housing. Now that's a national standard, and that there is some controversy regarding that number, whether that number applies really in all cases. And I think particularly in places with high transportation costs like Detroit, there's some controversy as to whether really households can afford that much in terms of rent. But 30% is the standard. That's what the federal government has set. So that gross rent, including utilities, is 30% of the monthly household income. I've included a vacancy factor. 7% is the national average for vacancy across the country. And that gives us the effective gross rent. That's the amount that we expect to actually collect each month. In Metro Detroit, operating expenses, average about $5,000 a year. There is some variation in terms of that. But I basically tried to look at several different indexes that measure operating expenses to get a sense of where that's at. So it seems like $5,000 a year is a fair number.
Particularly
so what you'll notice,
to keep a property up, right? So, sorry, Corey, just wanted to that's to keep the property where it's really quality housing. So when you start going below 5,000 a year, you are really starting to get to something that people say, oh, that light's been out in the hallway for a long time, or the elevator's not working again, or the banister's loose. When 5,000 a year says it is clean, it is well maintained, and it's a place that you would actually like to live.
That's right. Because think about if you're not able to spend $5,000 a year in operating expenses, you're gonna pay your property taxes. You're gonna pay your property insurance. You're gonna pay your water bill, right? All of those things can literally get you to lose your property. What you're gonna end up cutting are things like maintenance and repairs. So yeah, this is for, to keep a property in good measure.
And guys,
So
just quickly, we had a question in the chat. Is that $5,000 per year per unit? Is that
Yes, per unit.
Per
It's
unit.
5,000 per unit. Yeah.
great? So that
Yep.
seems like a magic number that people should be aware of.
So it really is. And so that's where a developer should come out. But even if they didn't come out there, the bank would tell them they need to come out at least there. So the developer can imagine all types of scenarios of wonderfulness and how they're going to get those costs down. But no financial institution will follow you into that wonderfulness. And that's the same thing with that vacancy at 7%. If you try to claim that you're going to have less than that, no one's going to accept it.
That's right. I know there are developers that can sometimes get that number below, but what they're often doing is they're often only counting the checks that they write. They're not counting their own time in that. So, oftentimes a small developer may, they may do their own property management. They may collect the rents themselves. They may cut the grass and do the snow and do lots of those types of activities. And so maybe it looks like their operating expenses are below $5,000 per year, but per unit per year. But honestly, if you start to account for their time, and if they were charging themselves for those services, you end up with $5,000 per unit per year, or somewhere around that. I always say that there's usually about a 10% variation in that. So, I would expect the range to be somewhere between $4,500 and $5,500 in actual costs.
Right.
But you'll see that, if you're a 20 or 30% AMI household, your rent does not cover the operating expenses. You see the red numbers there in net operating income. If you're a 40% AMI household, you have a total of $131 per month that you're making on that, and we'll talk about what that means later in terms of both your debt service and the payment to the developer. So one of the issues is that very low income rents have a hard time covering the basics. It's one of the reasons why kind of naturally occurring affordable housing typically slowly degrades in time, because like Richard said, it's repairs and maintenance that is usually cut first. And so if you're going on really thin margins, it's hard to maintain that that property, at a high level. So the next area is looking at kind of how much debt service, how much we could actually borrow, how much can we afford to pay in terms of our monthly loan. So there's a bolded maximum loan possible. So where my loan amount ended up being negative, I put, because there's no such thing as a negative loan, that the maximum loan possible is basically zero, right? So at 20 and 30%, you basically can't borrow for that unit. But then, as rents go up, your ability to borrow goes up correspondingly. Now, right now, cost per square foot for, and this is total cost. So this is both your construction costs, but also the cost of your architect, the cost of title insurance, all of those other costs. So what we would call both hard and soft costs is averaging around $230 a square foot for a low-rise building. So that's that should work for both new construction and for substantial rehabilitation. So, you know, an existing building that's in really bad shape where you basically have to, you're probably replacing everything but the shell of the building itself. The state of Michigan standard, so what the Michigan State Housing Finance Authority standard for a one-bedroom unit is 650 square feet. Again, we can argue whether that's a decent sized one-bedroom or not, but that's what the state says the minimum size for a one-bedroom unit is. So so you'll notice that it's a fixed cost to produce that unit, right? It's $149,500 to produce that unit, whether you're going to rent it to a low-income family or you're going to rent it to a higher income family. And so we can then, based on the loan amount, we can list how much loan debt service we can take. And I then figured out how much equity could we raise in terms of the project. And so the gap then is our total unit cost minus the loan amount minus the equity. And so you'll see that with the very low income projects, you basically, your gap is the entire project cost. And even in kind of the 40 and 50 and 60% range, you end up with very, very large gaps. A 60% AMI project, which is what the low-income housing tax credit program is at, you know, has an average gap per unit of $82,000. So more than half of the cost of producing that unit has to come from somewhere other than debt or equity. And where does that typically come from? It typically comes from the public, a public source in some way. So it could be low-income housing tax credits, it could be home dollars, it could be community development block grants, it could be housing trust fund dollars. It doesn't. There are lots of sources, but there's a caveat in that. Since the 60s, the amount of the U.S. budget that goes to community development programs has gone down significantly. So, and I should have grabbed it and included it in this. We actually have a graphic on NDC's website that shows that, you know, when you look at the 60s, about 3% of the budget went to programs related to community development. And now it's less than 0.5%. So, you know, yes, there are lots of programs. There's LIHTC and there's home and there's public housing and there's, you know, vouchers, and there are all these programs, but we are investing less and less each year in those. It's not keeping up with inflation. And I'm sure, Richard, with your experience with the Public Housing Authority, it shows that as well.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of what I was getting to just previously, in that, you know, probably even if you looked at the 60s level of funding, it wasn't enough to cover the number of people in need. And so each time they ratchet it down, I mean, it's a dramatic difference. You know, if we live in a city where 50% of the population, you know, lives at 60% AMI or less, then that's 300,000 people, 100,000 families, and we're only able to fund 10,000 of those families a year at the Housing Commission. And if you add even what Michigan's capable of doing, or what they are doing in this city, because they have the whole state to cover, then maybe you get another 10,000 families. So you got 20% of the people eligible covered by today's spending levels. And so it's to ratchet that up fivefold to cover people, then you would have to have a dramatically different system of financing. And when you add all of the LIHTC on, and all of the community development block grants and all of the home funds, then maybe you get maybe 1,000 more families per year, because we're not doing that many units when LIHTC is going full steam adding to those over the years, and so there's really inadequate funding in all of the programs to cover the affordable housing need of just Detroit. And so so there has to be a different model for who's going to come up with the $150,000 per unit necessary, who's going to come up with the $105,000 for a 50% AMI unit, and how that gets spread out in terms of absorbing that cost and adequately housing people. I think you said, at one of our pre-meetings, that the real solution is for all these people, or as many as possible of them, to make more money for us to
That's
have
right.
income that
So
pulls them up.
Michigan minimum wage is somewhere in the $8 an hour range. If there's 2,080 hours in a work year, you basically take that hourly wage and you double it. So that's about a $16,000 annual salary. Well, where does $16,000 put you? It puts you somewhere in that 30 to 40% AMI range. Well, the 30% AMI, again, doesn't even cover the operating expenses of the unit itself. So, we have not indexed minimum wage to inflation. And, all of those that say, well, we can't raise minimum wage because, it's going to become unaffordable, and no one's going to it's gonna impact teenagers without, as well as people with expenses. Actually, that's not true. That is as our president would say, fake news. Michigan's minimum wage law has an exception and has a different rate for people under 18 that are not emancipated. So our existing law would not cause that to happen. So we could easily raise minimum wage for working adults above this ridiculously low $8 an hour wage in order to get them to a point where the rent that they can pay at least covers the operating expenses of that unit. I don't think that that's too much to expect in wages.
Right, and I think what this chart shows is that, obviously, if wages are increased, it spreads the cost amongst the entire population. We all pay a little bit more when we go to the restaurant or to the grocery store or to buy a car or anything, because it filters throughout. But when that's not the case, when people are not making enough, then that burden gets pushed directly into either the people making less money, living in woefully inadequate housing, which a lot of our naturally occurring affordable is, because it can't be operated at a at even a break even. So you have to get, you get these scenarios where people are buying houses for $2,000 and they're putting $5,000 into them and renting them out to people, based upon the idea of they'll live where they can afford to live as opposed to where in the type of housing that people should have. And so it gets forced there, and people talk about trying to force it onto the developer, but you're looking at $140,000 a unit to force that on there, and its development isn't a compulsory activity, and so people just don't do it if there's not if it doesn't make financial sense. And one of the things that I like about this chart is it try to be conservative, right? Particularly conservatives. Now you're starting to hear people quote 240 just on the on the construction cost, and finding people who are willing to invest at only 10% ROI for a return on equity is that's that rational, reasonable investor, not the person trying to gouge. And so this is really saying, in a reasonable case scenario of a return and a reasonable case scenario of cost, these are the numbers. And so when you hear construction costs are going up, development costs are going up, then think in terms of ability to absorb affordability is going down. That $149,000 for a 30% AMI unit, which is is where they're saying half of Detroiters would qualify, based upon then that number is going to 200,000 as the gap when construction costs are going up, and so that burden is getting greater and greater and greater, and so it's that's the problem in a nutshell. That these are the economics of building housing, particularly in this area, but it's reasonably universal. And I think Corey used.
Richard, this is the same. This chart is based on a chart that I did in Cincinnati.
Right.
And it's the same issues in Cincinnati. It's the same issues in Cleveland. I'm doing some work in Dallas, and it's
right.
very similar issues. And this is math, and
right.
math, frankly, doesn't change, and it doesn't. It really doesn't matter what your belief system is. It is what it is. And it's also this. So part of the question that Sam asked was, well, why does development happen unevenly? Well, where you start to really make money is in that 2 to 225 a square foot rent per square foot range. So that's where development happens. Development happens where you can attract rents that are in that range. And you often end up with maybe people that are a little bit rent burdened. Oftentimes what's also happening is that the type of housing that's being constructed are a bunch of 1-bedrooms and sometimes even studios or smaller units.
Yeah.
And what's that? Yeah.
No, that's what I was agreeing that it's getting that cost per square foot down or that rent per square foot up by making as small of units as possible, and that's where the market's been going.
Right. I know that I'm not sure that I've seen it in Detroit yet, but in Cincinnati we've been seeing even micro units, which are studios at 350 square feet. I mean, I've stayed in hotel rooms bigger than some of these apartments, which is
oh, absolutely. I mean, there's one downtown, and it was really well received because people are saying, I want to be in this area, and I want to be able to pay $1,000 a month, and they're saying, okay, well, we'll give you $1,000 a month. It's just going to be the size of a hotel room. and so and people are making that choice, and we're talking about, you know, young professionals and empty nesters and the like, and so that's the rent burden before you even look at the affordable housing. There are more constraints. If you're getting home funds or getting LIHTC, you can't give someone a 300 square foot unit, even if they're willing to pay for it. So you have to build a certain size unit that people have decided is adequate. Rationally, they decide that's adequate because, you know, people try to, you know, squeeze people into a 200 square foot unit if they can force them to, based upon their poverty. So those rules are in place for a reason, but you're seeing people with more income choose to live in much smaller spaces to be where they want to be, and still pay the same amount of rent. And so there's all these factors kind of working against one another.
So guys, but before we leave this chart, I do just want to ask a couple clarifying questions and give the audience an opportunity to ask any questions about this chart. But I think you've already hit sort of like what I think is one of the central messages of this chart, that, you know, the fixed cost per unit is $149,000, right? And what makes it so difficult is that, you know, in markets where, well, in order, you know, obviously you get the most profit in markets where you can reach an audience that is making, you know, 150% AMI, and the rents are $3.40, right? I mean, that's sort of like on the far right. And so if you can collect those rents, you can pay for the operating costs, you can cover your debt and equity, and you know, you're in the green, right? Then as you move further left to the chart, you know, obviously the gap begins to increase. And so that break even point, if I'm reading this right, Corey, is that at like 90% AMI? That's like a break even point?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, that's break even point. Somewhere in that range is where you can make a 10% return on investment. And so it's not exactly, so you'll notice an exact 10% return on investment would be a gap of 0. So it's somewhere between that
right,
that 90 and 100% AMI.
And most Detroiters, well, I mean, you know, I mean, we're around the 50 to 60% AMI level. And Richard, I want to make sure that I heard I want to go back to something you said, that like there are 100,000 families in the city of Detroit that make what percentage AMI?
Well, so when people are saying there's this concept of using a Detroit AMI as opposed to the federal AMI, you know, ignoring the consistency of the numbers, just what they're trying to get to is that if half of Detroiters are, you know, if the median income of Detroit is at 29,000, then, you know, and the area median income is at 64,000, then it means that that the expectation is that half of Detroiters will actually qualify at that 50% AMI level. So I said 30, it should have been 50. You know, or 40%, somewhere right in there. That and half of Detroiters would be, you know, 300,000 people. If you're assuming 3 people per household, that's 100,000 households. And so you have this big need. I think one of the things to also remember when we're talking about that 10% ROI is assuming a certain level of risk, and this money is fungible. So you see all these things happening. The $340 a square foot, that's San Francisco, New York, maybe the top of Philly rents. And if you're sitting anywhere in the world and someone calls you with a project from Philadelphia, or they call you with a project from Detroit, then your money's going over to Philadelphia. And so you don't see institutional equity investors coming and building projects in Detroit. It's all developers and friends and family money you know, mixed with lots of subsidies to try to get those numbers to make sense. But also when people are expecting that there's a lot of risk, then they want more than a 10% ROI because 10% is the expectation. And the more someone says, well, I don't know if this is going to happen, you know, I don't know if this building's going to fill up, you know, then they say, well, I needed to project 20% just to get there. So when you're looking at a 10% ROI expectation, then our market's kind of bifurcated. That is downtown or midtown, where people feel comfortable that something's going to fill up, or something that is definitively a low-income tax credit project where they also believe is going to fill up. And so they say, okay, we have a certain amount of low-income people, working low-income people, and they'll be able to, they'll receive this housing this newly built housing that's subsidized. We'll invest in that. And there's a certain amount of relatively high-income people, if you're in the right area, and they'll receive this housing. That middle ground, where people say, hey, I like to build something nice on Greenfield and Joy, and it's not going to be subsidized, then that ROI requirement goes way up because they're not certain that market can absorb the rents necessary, even though obviously a good product on Greenfield and Joy will be well received. And so that's where you start getting who's going to put that money in, you know, and finding that money has to ultimately be this kind of institutional thing. And I'm going to plug Proposal N for a second because it gets directly to these numbers. One of the things that Detroit has as a benefit right now is that our property values went down so far during the financial crisis that we can go back in, and there was a question about the 2 and 3 bedrooms, and it's just exacerbated the bigger the unit you go to. But instead of $149,000 $500 gap, if you can get a nice 3-bedroom house at Greenfield and Joy, and for $15,000, and bring it all the way back up to just an amazing quality for $70,000, now you have a house that is $85,000 has been spent on it, and you've changed the dynamics of the rent. So now you can rent it for substantially less to a much broader group, and that's where it's trying to get to. How do we take advantage of that while we have this housing stock that may look really bad, but really bad in a house that's standing up straight, maybe $70,000 worth of repairs. And while the numbers don't make sense from what's the appraiser going to be after it's done, because it's still going to appraise for $30,000 until the appraisers decide they like the neighborhood. But that economics of now I have a viable house that's $85,000 that has been spent to make it top quality, naturally occurring, affordable housing, as opposed to $149,000. And that's that concept of how do we get out there? And now you're not trying to shove a family into a 1-bedroom. Now they have a 3-bedroom, they have a backyard, and when you start talking about who can get a mortgage on an $85,000 house, now that income comes way down. And so using those same criteria of 30% of your income, now you need someone who's making, a family making about $30,000 a year to be able to comfortably buy that $85,000 house. And so now you get 2 minimum wage people living in a household, and they can buy this newly remodeled house at $85,000 and own it. Whereas those 2 same people can't buy the $149,000 house that included, no profit to the developer, just the ability to build it. And so that's why people are trying to get in there and say, let's buy these houses and put $70,000 into them, even if the appraisal is only going to be $150. I mean, if the appraisal is only going to be $30, and we will make them available to people until that market comes around, or maybe we even sell it for 30 or something along those lines. But even if you sold it for 30, you lost less than if you try to do a new construction 1-bedroom. And so that's why the rehab of the houses is so important, and why you're seeing so much activity in that market. The home flippers are in there trying to do these houses because there's that gap. If you try to build new, you got 149 for a 1-bedroom. If you fix up what looks like a fairly horrid single family, you got 85, maybe 110. And so you, all these social issues we hear about, all these programs, are all based upon the reality of this chart.
So Richard, you spoke for a moment about like single family housing, right? And I know that this chart, I think, Corey, is meant, it sort of imagines a low to mid-rise multifamily building. Is that correct?
Yeah, and something that's either new construction or substantial rehabilitation. But yeah,
Right.
a low rise. You
Right.
start getting
High
6
rise
stories or
condition.
above.
Right.
You know,
Right. It kicks in a whole new phase of construction costs because of what you have to do in a high rise. But that's part of my.
Does it go up or down if you go over 6
Oh,
stories?
it goes up.
oh,
It
the
goes
construction costs go up.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Yeah, now you have to like pump water, you know, so up to about 5 stories, the water pressure, just the simple Detroit system water pressure, can push water up to the 5th floor. You start getting above that, and now you start having to pump water above that. There's all sorts of issues, and that's just one example of many that come with price.
Yeah, there's a whole list. They call them high-rise conditions, and so you have to build with much stronger materials. You have, because I mean, when you think about it, you have wind shear, you have more people moving throughout that building. You have stronger fire codes because you know they're so far up there beyond the fire truck ladder. So you get all these things that push it where a high-rise either needs to be hugely subsidized or it needs to be luxury.
got it. So you need to be able to charge a pretty healthy rent in order to pay for a high-rise building. Got it.
Right.
And is single-family housing a totally different animal? How does single-family housing fit into this chart?
It's not a totally different animal in terms of delivering a quality place to live. What it is because if you did new construction or you bought something that had, you know, massive fire damage, then you could end up at these same numbers. Where single family housing is so different in Detroit is that we had a lot of foreclosed or abandoned housing that's not as bad off as you might imagine, and it's selling way below what it would cost to build to that level. And so you'll kind of see it where the focus has been on the brick housing first, because it doesn't deteriorate as fast. And so you can get this house where to get, you know, the acquisition to go to build on a piece of land to the point where you have solid framing and a brick veneer that where all the systems need to be replaced. That might cost you in construction costs $70,000. And so now you're building out, adding your wiring and the like, and your, you know, flooring and those type things. So when you walk up to something that has a solid frame and a brick veneer, but it's only selling for $5,000 to $15,000, you are capturing that savings between 70 and that acquisition price in the cost. And so because we have all these houses laying around that aren't very much, but they are standing up, to get a something standing up generally costs $70,000. And when you can get it for 15, you can now actually drop the rent and still cover your cost. There's this opportunity that's occurring, and taking advantage of that opportunity before the house deteriorates to the point that it's not standing up anymore, and now we need to just spend $20,000 to knock it down. That's what we're in this race to do. How many houses can we get done while they're still salvageable?
Although, I mean, you know, it's amazing. You know, I've tromped through a lot of abandoned buildings in my career, and it's pretty amazing. As long as those exterior walls are straight, you could have no floors and rebuild the floor system and still have a viable house. And what I think unfortunately in many ways our standard for demolition, because we have so many vacant houses, is actually way too high. I think a lot of these houses are salvageable. We have such a surplus of them that
I completely agree. So I completely agree, and even as the person, on part of the group that had been knocking them down, I still completely agree. What it is kind of getting people to believe in that house, right? So a lot of wood frame houses can be redone as well. And there were houses where I saw it, I was like, that one, I felt like it could have been saved. But getting people to believe in that house, it's much easier to get them to believe in the how well you can come back and redo the brick stuff first. And so it's low hanging fruit. And so, but that real true break even point, oh yeah, basically anything that's not laying down is going to cost you less than $150,000. So we have a ton of salvageable houses. And one of the interesting things is, I'm always pointing people out to, well, what we call a non-salvageable house in Detroit, the little 850 square foot, wood frame house, is what you would call in Ferndale a $200,000, wonderful home that someone's put a bunch of money into.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the exact same house. And so what a lot of professionals have noticed about Detroit is we have really good bones. We have really good housing stock that would justify the value, the money put into it. One of the things that I also like about this chart is it gets to value of a dwelling as opposed to necessarily the appraised value of a dwelling. So if you can house someone at $800 a month rent or $400 a month rent, then that has a value in itself if it's a high quality house. And so if the appraisal comes in at $16,000 and you spent $80,000, people would say, oh, well, that's a bad deal. Except for now you can house someone. And so, we had downtown originally. No one expected the appraisal to be anywhere near the total development cost, and it's still trailing. It's just not trailing by as much. But you were able to house people, and so that's where you get into the value of those subsidies. That says, am I able to house someone in a high quality house? And if I can do that at $80,000 instead of $150,000, then that is a value in itself. Who cares what the appraisal says? And just like Boston Edison and East English Village, the appraisals come around once you hit a critical value, a critical mass of houses that everybody said was only worth $30,000. You put 100 of them together, and now the appraisals pop up to being 100,000, such that it makes sense. And so this, one of the things I like about this chart is really showing what you can get for your money. And so when you can find a way to break out of this mold, and by not doing new construction or substantial rehab of a large building, it makes all the difference in the world. And we have a bunch of single family housing. I always believe that in general, a family, would rather live in a single family house if the neighborhood is safe than in a multifamily building. And I kind of say that as someone who's always apologizing to their neighbors about, my 10-year-old doing cartwheels on the floor above them because I live in a high-rise condo. And so it's it's a different experience. And so if you have a backyard and a front yard and a place to go with your family.
We have that culture here.
Right.
We have that tradition here. Unlike some cities that are more dominated by multifamily. And so, that's I think that's our preference here. And I just can't agree more with Richard that we have such good housing stock here. And one of the things that, as Richard was alluding to, once you start getting to a couple hundred units in an area, right, and then you've kind of re-densified that neighborhood. Well, now it's more affordable it's more possible for retail to come in, and then you start to get those services, and that's, I think, where really you start to see the appraisals going up. Is you make those initial investments, you help re-densify the neighborhood. Now there's a small grocery store, or there's a coffee shop, or there's those types of services, and now people are willing to pay more for those houses. So now then you start seeing resell that are at a higher price. So it kind of builds on itself.
No, it definitely does. And the funny thing is the neighborhoods that people tout as, being, the focus now, it happened over 30 years. But, when I was growing up in this city, what was then called Cass Corridor was not a nice place. and it's, it was not somewhere where you wanted to roam around and the like. You didn't go very far off Wayne State's campus. You didn't go very far away from Cass High School. And so it was built into this highly desirable place over time by doing this thing of saying, getting these things up, subsidizing them enough that you get this density, and then the coffee shops come and people want to be there. And now it's like, oh yeah, well, it's unfair. Midtown, gets all the excitement. Well, that was a lot of building from a place of, and it shows an example of what may have been considered one of the worst residential parts of the city in the 80s, now being considered one of the best residential parts, that this is possible in this city to take what is considered to be the worst and make it into the best.
So guys, I'd like to pause there real quick, because we've had a couple questions come up, and I know there's other slides and other things that we want to get to, but let me pivot real quick to David Palmer has his hand raised. So David, did you have a question you wanted to throw out there?
Sure. No, I really appreciate the math approach, because working with community organizations across the city, this is sort of a key factor in helping to bridge how much of a struggle it is to get to what is often being demanded by community groups versus the realities. And thinking about the single family housing stock, Mr. Leon was correct. This city is built around single family housing and not multifamily for the most part. So we have 16 HUD approved agencies for first-time home buyers in the city of Detroit, which is twice as many as any other city in the US with between 600 and 700,000 people. We have 20,000 some odd properties at Detroit Land Bank Authority. And we just listened to a good conversation about, the opportunity to get these single family structures into the hands of folks wanting to rehab. The question is how is that partnership possible when it seems to be an entire lack of convening? So I FOIA'd the 9902 forms for those 16 HUD agencies, which I hope to get sometime in November, to try to figure out what the impact and volume of education going through those organizations is for the city. So if you can get $7,500 in down payment assistance through MSHDA, as a first-time home buyer on an $85,000 house, that makes numbers doable from a mortgage perspective, so long as there's education and wraparound. So I've not had good support in the past or collaboration in the past with transparency or collaboration efforts with the land bank. And it seems there needs to be some sort of convening between land bank interests, community group interests, and some or all of these 16 HUD education certified organizations. So curious as to your thoughts on how to make that cocktail palatable, and that ways to make this move to scale so that it doesn't support the flippers, so to speak. As a real estate broker, I've been through a lot of these flips and they're crap. things are falling apart before new buyers even move in. And to think about, you know, that collaboration that yields workforce programming for the upscale of these $70,000 investments and get these into the hands of actual Detroiters, rather than subsidizing folks moving in from somewhere else, which is essentially what a lot of the low-income housing, 80% AMI seems to do in multifamilies.
So I always like to draw a line because I always join into these things to speak as Richard Hosey, private person, but I am on a lot of these boards, and so it kind of so I have some information kind of about it, but I don't want to ever be confused as speaking on behalf of the Detroit Land Bank because I just don't. But I would like to engage that conversation very directly in terms of how do we get to scale? How do we convene something? So so many times it comes down to a belief system of where you can allocate resources, who's really ready to go, and how do you get these things done, right? So there was the Rehab and Ready program was to target exactly what you were saying, that just the home flippers, you don't know what they're going to bring it to. You don't know, and they were facing kind of some of the economics of, okay, can I really sell this thing for $80,000, or do I need to sell it for 50? If I need to sell it for 50, I need to only put in 30, and that's going to create this craft that you were talking about. And so one of the things, the program that that the Detroit Land Bank did, I won't say we because I'm not speaking on behalf of them, was to actually lose up to $30,000 a house, making sure that the house was ready, that it was truly ready to go, and saying, you know, we are fine because there was the house was already in the inventory, so acquisition of zero, put $100,000 into the house and then sell it for 70 or more. And so now there will be people, particularly when the Detroit Land Bank did that prior to the Duggan administration, and those numbers were massive, $200,000 losses per house. There was a lot of argument about doing that. In Boston Edison and East English Village, people actually back then said that there would never be a time when Boston Edison homes would be worth $400,000. So to put that into it was ridiculous. And now, of course, if you could get one for $400,000, everybody's happy. But taking that there, you jumpstart these neighborhoods sometimes by taking a loss. But now, when you look at losing $30,000 a house versus losing $149,000 to do that house, or $82,000 to get it at the 60%, then that's what we're comparing. Once you have that standard in a neighborhood, once you have that momentum going, then that pushes up the appraised values that can be achieved, allowing better flippers to still make money, providing truly quality product and a comparison against that quality product. So I think the convening that needs to be done is preparing people for when it's the right time to go into that neighborhood. Because if you go into the neighborhood before the land bank goes in there, then all the economics leans towards doing crap and selling it to whoever you can get away with. And that doesn't work well with any of the HUD programs, because they're going to inspect and the other programs, because they want to know that they've got the quality program. So I think the convening should be after the land banks or the city of Detroit, now that they're taking over the program, gets in there and primes the pump when it's time and safe for properly vetted, people to get in there.
Builds that market.
Right, to build that market. And so that's what's been happening all over the city. And it's a slow process, because it takes, a certain amount of money just to build them. And then you have to be willing to lose some money up front. But I think of those, that quote unquote lost money as infrastructure. If someone said, there was an article talking about losing $300,000 going into a neighborhood where the houses weren't salvageable. But if you try to just repave that street, I'm sure it would be $300,000 to repave that street, and no one would complain. So if I can turn a neighborhood around by dropping $300,000 into it and quote unquote losing it, then I think that's good infrastructure dollars and pays off in happiness and less blight. But also, I feel very confident that if you look at the math of the quote unquote lost federal dollars that went into East English Village and Boston Edison, getting those house values up to the actual taxes that are paid on the neighborhood now, not just even those houses, but the neighborhood, then I think it's been a huge, wonderful investment, such that if you looked at using city money now and getting these values up, even taking some nominal losses with it to get the values up, you actually end up with a positive return on your tax dollars. But getting the right people in at the right time is the key. Now, one of the things I found with both downtown and midtown is the more people believed that it should work, the more it did work. So downtown and midtown, we had a lot of bad actors in the market. But once you started having quality products, then bad actors they stood out, because they could no longer say, I have to run a slum property in the middle of downtown Detroit because that's all I could do. No one else will be here. Once someone showed that what was possible, they really stood out, and you could really go after them. And they tended to either sell or shape up because their excuses were no longer there. And that belief that it should work made a big difference. I believe that in some of even our down payment assistance programs, there's not a strong belief that this is going to work. And you see it in the slowness, the staffing, the cumbersome nature of how long it is to get these down payment assistance. But when you have a swell of this is working, except for program X is holding it up, people rush to fix program X because they don't want to be the person that's the problem. And so
And
it's
for
kind of an environment.
For renovation of housing,
Oh, did we?
Yeah, it looks like Corey looks like he froze.
Corey is frozen. That's okay, because hopefully he can come back soon.
So I just want to throw one more plug in for the renovation of housing because I really love it, in that it does another thing. You will hear over and over and over about the inability to get Detroit contractors on these large projects, and that's based upon bonding and the amount of capital that is necessary to buy 50 furnaces to install or 50 units worth of wiring to get in there. Over and over and over, when you look at the single family housing, you are much, much more able to get Detroit contractors in there in a profitable way and use them and put their expertise to work. And so it's also a way to, and then they can build up their capital and their resume to then go down and have the money to be bondable to do these larger projects. So you have so many benefits in this development ecosystem by doing this.
Yeah. So a quick time check. We have about like 35 minutes left, and we definitely want to make sure we give people a chance to ask questions if they have any. But maybe this is a good conversation segue into how can citizens and residents engage with developers, right? So if we're talking about developing neighborhoods, we're talking about reducing blight, even at times touching on the issue of flipping houses and gentrification. But yeah, maybe I should just start with that sort of like basic question of how can residents engage with developers, and are there any good examples of that?
So I think that what I found was the kind of the best way was that I was a neighbor and they were coming to speak to their neighbors saying, hey, what's going on? What are you doing there? And those individual conversations. When you start getting into the larger, more structured, sometimes it's set up of this is the developer, go after them, or and you're trying to do all this building on support. But I understand that just the neighbor method doesn't always work because people need some structure to understand when's the meeting and how it works. But I think the more there's a common knowledge of how this system works, the easier those conversations are, because I find a lot of the disconnect is between the knowledge of these numbers and the rational desires of people, especially without understanding how much the request will cost, and saying, you know, obviously people want nice stuff. No one's like, oh yeah, no, build some substandard crap in my neighborhood. They of course want nice stuff. They want some amenities and all these things. Understanding those dollars, I think would level set that conversation for everyone, so that when they say I need 30% AMI housing in my neighborhood, they're saying I need someone to absorb $150,000. And it's like, let's go to the city, let's go to the federal government and see if we can get that, or they would know what to ask for. I think that lack of that common understanding makes those conversations a lot harder and a lot more contentious.
Kind of. So, I mean, how can residents help a developer even like make those asks? Like, is there any way? Have you seen any examples of that?
Yeah, I think I see it probably more in the owner-occupied neighborhoods. You know, when I did my project on Kirby, you know, a lot of the people on that block own their homes, and that building was the blight. You know, there was some shaping up that needed to be done, but that building was the blight, and they were like, I heard you just bought this blighted building. How long before you take this blight out of my neighborhood? And so, you know, they were supportive, and their big issue is how fast can you get this done, more so than what are you doing here. You know, are you trying to change the nature of our neighborhood? There were a lot of owners on that block, and so they felt like this building was, and they were right, was holding their property values down. And so they were supportive, and they would come, you know, if there was some public comment, it was positive public comment. It was also at a time, though, when people worried less about being priced out or things along those lines. And so when you get more renters in a neighborhood, then they have to worry about being priced out. You know, I told you I actually spoke to someone who I think was in the future associated with D4 as something. We sat down and had a conversation. He said he lived next door to this building. And when I finished it, you know, he was actually a renter, and landlord jacked his rent up. It was like, finally, I can make some money. You know, this guy's charging $1,400. I can charge $1,200. And so he actually was displaced by this project coming up. And we had a conversation about the economics and how that works, and why I needed to charge as much as I charged for that building, and how that affected him. But it was, you know, he still wasn't unhappy to see the blight removed from the neighborhood. Finding some way to offset that effect probably would have been more of it of his desire than just being like, oh yeah, I moved next to a blighted building so that I could have really low rents. I think people want to have the value of no blight. They don't want to have the negative impacts of no blight, and that's where that focus needs to be.
Got it. So
The other,
oh, Corey, yeah, did you?
yeah, yeah, I would just say, you know, the other thing is, ask questions, ask pointed questions, ask questions about the economics. We have a couple slides here related to the economics of a deal. And frankly, this is not magic. This is addition and multiplication. And so, you know, I have a little case study, and this is something that so we probably can't get through, but, you know, at your leisure, feel free to read over the case and look at the answer key that is attached. All of the numbers are basically fairly easy to go through. So, for example, go to the next. Not that one. The next one. So, figuring out how much a project can make in terms of net operating income is fairly straightforward. It's looking at how much they can make in rent, how much they're going to count for vacancy, and again, how much those operating expenses are. And that gives you what's called net operating income. And then using net operating income, you can do some fairly basic math again to figure out how much of a loan a project can attract, and then using that loan amount to figure out your debt service. You can figure out how much cash the project should generate on an annual basis. And then, basically, unless the project's getting some sort of government money, most projects operate based on two sources. Loans, typically from banks, and equity that comes from the owner. So we can pretty quickly figure out what the economics of a project is, and there's no quadratic equations here. There's no calculus here. This is all 5th grade math. This is all basic stuff that most people can do, and I think getting educated on that is really important. And so you can help enhance that conversation by understanding the economics behind it. So if you find that, in fact, the cash on cash rate of return, for example, is 30%, well then, and that, maybe for that neighborhood, most people are asking for 15%, then there's some room for discussion regarding affordability. But, as in this case, this is trying to build units that are going to be rented at $650 a month. So that's 20 units at $650 a month. And then times 12 is to make it an annual rent. Well, trying to rent things at that low level, you end up with a very, very low return. And so somehow we're going to have to make up, this gap. So
I completely agree. And I that's why I love this math method. It did remind me of something that if I take the same group and I'm having a community benefits conversation, then and I move that conversation over to a how can they be involved conversation, then how can they buy the 4-family next to the new 50 unit that's being built, or how can they do, then we are immediately going to those numbers and showing how they can get involved, and we ultimately end up at a conversation about subsidies, because when you get to that gap or when you get to that equity requirement, then people say, well, that's unfair that to participate you have to have this huge equity requirement in a community that one, the numbers are going to be thin if when you have to put this equity up, but also has been historically not flush with capital because of past and current discrimination. And people start talking about, okay, what programs are there, down payment programs, other things to get you this equity portion so that I can participate in this real estate. And when you show them, okay, well, actually the the FHA loan will actually cover up to a 4-family, so you could buy a 4-family, live in one of them, rent it out. Then we are immediately talking about these numbers, and they are, you know, kind of on board with this idea of they need to make some type of adequate profit, because when a unit's empty, they don't want to lose the house. And when a refrigerator needs to be replaced, they don't want to take a huge loss. So they need to make enough money that when the refrigerator goes bad, they don't tell people I'll get it 3 months from now when I have some more profit. They can say I made enough profit in the last 3 months. I'm replacing your refrigerator. And so when that conversation gets to participating in Detroit's revitalization, then I find that 98% of the contention goes away. When the conversation is about how someone can come in and expect to make profit in their community, then you get a lot more contention.
So I think this is actually a really important point that I hear a lot from community groups. This notion of like, you know, rate of return, developer profitability. I mean, I think to your point, Corey, as residents are engaging with developers, right, to ask pointed questions about the financials, and I think inevitably that conversation is going to turn to quote unquote profitability. So, you know, I'm interested to any general thoughts you guys have, but I have a specific question, which is, you know, Richard, earlier you mentioned that if a developer is going to be developing in a riskier market, right? Like let's say outside of downtown or midtown, you know, a neighborhood, that the ROI requirements increase, right? You need more than 10%. Does that requirement, is that being put on by like the bank or like where are those requirements?
So some of it's being put on indirectly by the bank, that they are not following you into your dream, right? So the bank saying, okay, that's really wonderful that once you finish doing this project, you're certain that you're going to get $2 a square foot. This looks like $1.20 a square foot neighborhood, and we're loaning as though it's going to get $1.20 a square foot. So, you know, when we did the Project Tower, the appraiser and me as the banker, we did not follow into this, oh, Detroit's going to be a wonderful path. In fact, the bank made me.
That's how Richard and I met. Was
Right,
Project Tower.
right. Exactly. And so they said, you're going to finish this project for you. It's going to be a luxury, wonderful place. And you're going to get exactly what people are getting currently in downtown, maybe a little bit more. And that's what we're loaning against. And so the developer had a much higher equity requirement and had to get more subsidies to get the equity requirement down to a different number. But so that forces this thing of, if you win, you end up with a higher ROI because no one's going to believe that you're going to win. And so the developer is making this, I believe, in the market changing thing, and banks and equity investors tend not to believe that with you. For an equity investor to believe that with you, they need to have a high enough expectation that they say, it turns out if you're wrong, I still do all right. So they'll run those numbers that say, I get a 10% ROI if you're wrong, and I get more if you're right. And so, which I think, when you think of each individual person, if they were a bet on who is selling them on this wonderful new world, that's exactly the analysis each of us would make individually. Like, I'm gonna invest as though you're wrong until I know you're right, and that creates this higher NOI requirement because they are chopping down your numbers to where they can believe them, as opposed to accepting this higher number of change.
And you know, banks are naturally conservative, and they really should be, because banks don't see any upside, right? What the bank is going to make is the interest rate on the loan. So if your project does great, they see no benefit. If your project does terribly, what do they have to risk? What do they risk? Well, they risk their entire loan amount, right? And so if they represent 80% of your project, then, that could be like in this project, this is a $4.1 million project. They're risking over $3 million if you're wrong. And so we have to keep that in mind. Banks are going to be naturally conservative in terms of that. Investors do have that upside potential, but they get paid last, and so a lot has to get a lot has to go right before that investor sees any money out of the deal. And so again, they're also risking risk and reward. And I like to think of Richard as a better looking Lady Justice, blind justice with the two scales, that basically every developer, every investor is they're weighing what's my potential upside and what's my potential downside. What are my risks and what are my rewards? And those have to balance out. And we also have to think that, investors can invest in anything. They don't even have to invest in real estate. So, frankly, if a real estate investment trust is, paying a regular dividend of 8%, and your single family home project isn't generating even that, why would they take the risk of putting all their eggs in one basket when they can, invest in something that, gives a broad diversity, that gives, that overall has less risk. So it's always that risk reward balance that we have to keep in mind.
So it really is, even at the entity level. But one of the interesting things that also occurs is, Bank of America isn't just one person with a Bank of America t-shirt and a pile of cash. I always tell people, a bank is a bunch of employees trying not to get fired. And so it's, and the REITs are as well. And so when you'll notice a trend of Dick Buss and me and Aaron.
All those ex-bankers, are you saying?
All the ex-bankers who charged into Detroit said, we're going to make it happen, and we're no longer bankers because you are using up a lot of inside political capital when you say, let's do Detroit. And they're like, no, remember we said Chicago. We smile when you say Chicago, and we don't smile when you say Detroit. And so you have to have these compelling arguments, and that also gets the right increased ROIs and upside and expectation. If you are sitting in a REIT in the middle of Chicago and you say, let's do Detroit, then they say, you're going to have to tell me how we're going to make 30% in Detroit versus making 8% in Chicago, because there's such a different perception. And so as we change that perception, that those numbers come down. But for that employee not to get, fired, and they can't say, let's do Detroit at the same ROI as Chicago, but still they're going to be looked at with a jaundiced eye until that project turns out to be a home run. It's and even after, people are like, why do we keep taking these crazy risks just to make you happy with your mission of doing Detroit, which is exactly what I heard at the bank, even with the successes. And it's Aaron used to always joke with me, Aaron Sieber, who was at Chase forever. He was on the Broadway Tower. He's like, we can only have home runs in this market because you get a bump in the road and you get fired. So it's like home run.
Not only do you get fired, but then you become a legend in the bank, and that or the project becomes a legend in the bank.
Right.
Oh yeah, we lost money. We lost money on such and such deal in Detroit.
Right.
So any Detroit project for as long as that legend's around is looked at with that jaundiced eye.
Yes, without a doubt. And they remember losses a lot more than they remember wins.
We always do. Everyone does.
Right. And so it's So all these things come together into this development ecosystem of how do you get things done in this market. And so as a developer, I talk to bankers about how I'm not going to get them in trouble with them following me into a neighborhood, because that's their number one concern, and it's hard for me to even imagine raising true third-party equity. I wasn't born with family money, so I had to use all my savings from 20 years of working to jump off the cliff with. And I tend to partner with people who have their own money, because even just calming people down in what's going on in Detroit is, just managing their expectation and their worries is so much easier to work with partners. And then when we get into equitable development in terms of who's owning these properties, then you start getting into a whole new conversation of, well, if third-party money isn't eager to come into Detroit anyway, then how do you get there to be some ownership of people who are, Detroiters? It's because you have this knowledge base. Corey, you grew up in here and you know everything about development, and it's like, well, who's gonna give you $1 million to go do your first project, as opposed
Right.
to it's so.
Because I didn't grow up with money either,
Right, right, exactly. And so it's so then you get into this thing of who's owning the development, where's the money coming from. And so when people say, let's slash all of the subsidies, let's get rid of the brownfield, let's get rid of the historic, then one of the things they're also doing is taking rungs out of the step that allows somebody like me who use those subsidies to transition from employee to owner, taking those out. That says, because even with 20 years worth of savings and putting it all into my first deal, I couldn't have did that without the subsidies that were in place at that time. And so then you're saying development shall be owned by people who had historic assets inherited, that they inherited, and so, and that doesn't look like the general Detroiter. And so getting people to truly understand as much as possible, not be able to build a 10-page pro forma, but really understand kind of the connections to and what's going on. So when they say, let's get rid of the brownfield tax credit, they know that they're saying, let's make it harder for the Detroiter who gets the knowledge to get into being an owner, or let's make it harder to provide affordable housing in this city, that they know kind of what's going on, as opposed to saying, let's make sure that in exchange for these subsidies, there's the realistic amount of affordability and ownership, and let's go with adding the proper controls as opposed to wiping things out in the name of not helping subsidize developers.
Yeah. So we have 10 minutes left. Wanted to do a quick time check there. I mean, we've talked a lot about the risk reward, and I think you guys have already completed the task that we asked you, which is sort of explaining, like, why is there uneven development across the city of Detroit, but then also, how does the Detroit market compare to other cities, right? Like Richard, you just said that, somebody from a large bank, they have to convince their coworkers that they can see a 30% return to Detroit, where, they only need like 8% in Chicago, if I understood what you were saying correct.
Right. And so because the money is fungible and organizations are larger, so, and Detroit's further behind. So a lot of other cities really started getting going in the mid 80s, such that by the mid 90s and by 2000, they were a known quantity. So, in the mid 80s, Chicago was not a place where people were eager to put money.
And that's not all 582 square miles of Chicago either.
Right.
I mean,
no, you go to South Side.
I mean,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
So, let's keep that in mind as well, is
Right.
that, things like mass transit. I mean, there are so many areas that need to be addressed, our transportation system in this city, but also, things like, we'd mentioned the minimum wage. The Community Reinvestment Act has been dramatically, there are proposed rules that would dramatically change what banks are required to do in cities. And it would dramatically reduce banks' commitments to lend where they take deposits, which is the basic premise of the Community Reinvestment Act. That doesn't seem to be on many people's radar. And it's very distressing because it is one of the few programs that help keep banks engaged in urban areas.
So absolutely, and so in so many cities, that was the driver. We have to put this money out anyway. Now, one of the most amazing when I moved back home in 2008 things that I found, because I was so used to being like, well, we got to do it anyway. We have this CRA responsibility. Was it around 2000 or was it even earlier where so the line for where CRA occurred and how it worked in Detroit was changed to leave Oakland County out of it. And so as the banks moved out to Troy, the deposits were in Troy. And so if you're in a Houston or Chicago metro land, that still all gets sucked into the same thing. Move that bank to whatever suburb you want, that money's still going into Chicago. But here, they actually carved the line at Oakland County, such that we're in a different AMI.
It's a micro, oh God, what the name of it? It's Warren Troy Farmington is considered a micro MSA, I believe is what
right.
it's
It's right. And so they trapped it all out there. So when I was at Bank of America looking at our CRA, it was 13 million a year inside of Detroit and 130 million in Oakland County and outside in that area. And so they actually made it where they took away my ability to say we have to do it in Detroit, which was a particularly spectacular trick that I'm sure when I noticed, because it sounds like this, odd, nuanced, esoteric concept. And that's how we built our suburbs, because, our farms were low income areas and you had to put the money in. Let's build some more tract housing out there at 24 Mile. And it was CRA eligible. And so and that's what other cities did inside the city. And so you get to these little things like what Corey's talking about, and they have these huge impacts while going unnoticed.
Yeah.
So we have a few minutes left, and I just quickly want to do a plug for our last session. So I think you guys are already beginning to talk about how do we solve some of these problems, right? And highlighting things like the Community Reinvestment Act, which is a very important thing that probably not enough community advocates are talking about. So on our last session, which will be, was it November 18th, I believe? I should know all these things off the top of my head. We are going to be bringing back all of the speakers and kind of getting creative, right? We're hoping to have a facilitated conversation about what do we do about some of the issues that we've been talking about over the previous 3 sessions, and how do we just encourage more equitable development as a whole. So, I guess I'm putting a small plug to you, Corey. Begin thinking about if there are solutions that you want to highlight there. That would be a great time to do it. If there are additional questions that anybody from the audience has, I don't know if we're going to be able to get to them today, but please feel free to email them to D4. You can email info@metrodetroitd4.org. So again, that's info@metrodetroitd4, D as in dog. Thank you, Francis, for putting that in the chat. And we promise that if you send us a question, we will send it to Richard and Corey, and we will get you an answer and email it back. So I in these last couple minutes, Corey, Richard, we can't thank you enough for being here. Do you have any closing thoughts, or is there anything that you really want community residents to take away as they think about how to engage developers, or you know, how to see things from a developer's perspective?
So what I always love it, and one of the things that we, you know, I always try to make myself available to do is give people insight on how to do a project of their own, even just an example project or a very small project, whatever fits into particularly an organization's budget. And because it could just be a 4-family, because by the end of that project, they have both a great understanding of the developer's perspective, but also the community's perspective. So they're also better able to go to, you know, because not all developers are wonderful people, and certainly not all of them are telling the truth. And that you're really able to point out, hey, no, I did this for exactly this amount. I was able to maintain it, and this is how I'm doing it, and point out their lives. The experience of doing a small representative project the way you want to in your area is huge. It's huge in terms of knowledge and credibility. And I'm always interested in talking to someone who needs some understanding of how to get one of those started, because it changes the conversation in both ways. You really know what community benefits could be gotten out of a project if you do a project.
I totally agree, you know, and there is a wide variety of developers out there. And so, you know, trying to understand some of these issues are important. And also just remember that housing is one aspect of a larger economic ecosystem. So, you know, we have to think about wages, we have to think about regulation, we have to think about the overall market. Housing is not a silo. Housing interacts with all of these other areas.
Good thoughts. All right. Well, you know, surprising no one, time ran out really quickly. It is always great talking with you, Richard, and you, Corey.
Especially when Richard and I are talking together. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
no, you know, that's.
We knew, yeah, we weren't worried about you two interacting with one another. Yeah, coming up with good discussion points. Yeah, but I mean, thank you again, guys. We really appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, if you have questions that you want to ask, please send them to D4. We'll make sure to get you an answer. And we also look forward to seeing you on November 11th, where we will be getting into development incentives and kind of explaining how those work. And then, of course, on November 18th, also at 9 a.m., we're going to be bringing the speakers back, and we're going to be having a conversation about what do we do about all this, and how do we encourage equitable development in the future. So thank you all, and we will see you next time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.